remember our next guest.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good afternoon. We're coming on the air with breaking news. The special counsel whose probe led to the first criminal charges, federal charges ever filed against a former president, just spoke to the American people. It was the first time we've heard from special counsel Jack Smith since he was appointed to lead the investigation. His statement comes after the indictment of Donald Trump was unsealed this afternoon. It detailed 37 counts of breaking 7 different laws, all related to his handling of classified documents at his Mar-a-Lago home. Those charges include 31 counts of willful retention of national defense information. This was Jack Smith just moments ago.
Today, an indictment was unsealed, charging Donald J. Trump with felony violations of our national security laws, as well as participating in a conspiracy to obstruct justice. This indictment was voted by a grand jury of citizens in the Southern District of Florida, and I invite everyone to read it in full to understand the scope and the gravity of the crimes charged.
The Justice Department also just released these new photos of those documents, and the indictment says they came from all of the top national security and law enforcement agencies, including the CIA, the Pentagon, and the NSA. The indictment also says he showed classified documents to others twice in 2021. And as a reminder, Mr. Trump has denied any wrongdoing. Let's go to our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett. What are the takeaways? You've had time to work your way through the documents. You heard the special counsel.
Yeah, his words pretty remarkable there. For the first time, he's breaking his silence after being appointed last fall, clearly choosing his words carefully, knowing that we're scrutinizing everything that he says. It's interesting to see how he highlighted the gravity, the scope of these allegations. This document lays out painstaking detail, extraordinary revelations here, some of which had been reported, but some of which had not, including the fact that Mr. Trump is at least alleged to have showed people who did not have authority classified information.
All right, thank you, Laura. We're going to pause our coverage very briefly to send some of you back to tennis. For everyone else, our special report continues in a few seconds. All right, we are back. Our coverage continuing after special counsel Jack Smith's statement to the American people after he filed federal criminal charges against former President Trump over his handling of classified documents. Now we want to play some more of Smith's statement. Here it is.
Good afternoon. Today, an indictment was unsealed, charging Donald J. Trump with felony violations of our national security laws, as well as participating in a conspiracy to obstruct justice. This indictment was voted by a grand jury of citizens in the Southern District of Florida, and I invite everyone to read it in full to understand the scope and the gravity of the crimes charged. The men and women of the United States intelligence community and our armed forces dedicate their lives to protecting our nation and its people. Our laws that protect national defense information are critical to the safety and security of the United States, and they must be enforced. Violations of those laws put our country at risk. Adherence to the rule of law is a bedrock principle of the Department of Justice, and our nation's commitment to the rule of law sets an example for the world. We have one set of laws in this country, and they apply to everyone. Applying those laws, collecting facts, that's what determines the outcome of an investigation. Nothing more and nothing less. The prosecutors in my office are among the most talented and experienced in the Department of Justice. They have investigated this case hewing to the highest ethical standards, and they will continue to do so as this case proceeds. It's very important for me to note that the defendants in this case must be presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. To that end, my office will seek a speedy trial in this matter, consistent with the public interest and the rights of the accused. We very much look forward to presenting our case to a jury of citizens in the Southern District of Florida. In conclusion, I would like to thank the dedicated public servants of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, with whom my office is conducting this investigation, and who work tirelessly every day upholding the rule of law in our country. I'm deeply proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with them. Thank you very much.
That was the entirety of his statement. He took no questions, and given the way he has conducted this investigation, we doubt we'll hear much more, if anything, from him. Danny, as he spoke, he mentioned defendants. Can we remind folks who the second person is here?
Waltine Nauta, a former Navy person, came over from the White House with Trump, is now his aide, described in the indictment, I believe, as his, quote, body man. This is somebody who knows former President Trump pretty intimately. His name appears over and over again in the indictment. He is one of the alleged co-conspirators, and somebody who apparently was involved, at least allegedly, in the conduct that formed the basis of many of these charges. So these conspiracy charges are interesting to me. And Laura pointed out earlier that the government did have meetings with Nauta, and Nauta and his legal team were at the time not interested in apparently cooperating. Who knows if that will change, but very interesting that of all the people and all the text messages and all the emails that were reviewed, I am a little surprised you see only one co-conspirator. One wonders if there might be a superseding indictment somewhere along the line. I don't suspect that. I don't see that right now.
Superseding indictment would mean?
A superseding indictment is basically like an amendment to where you issue a new indictment, possibly with new defendants, new charges, something like that. But no particular reason to think that. But I do find it fascinating that of this wide-ranging investigation, they settled on only one co-conspirator.
Well, the indictment does say that even though Nauta is the only named co-conspirator, that there are other co-conspirators, both known and unknown to the grand jury.
Yeah, and what about other witnesses? We heard about all these people coming into the grand jury. They didn't tip their hand in terms of who they have.
I think they're trying to protect the integrity of the investigation. It probably remains ongoing. And of course, there might be some overlap. Remember, this is only one slice of Jack Smith's investigation. He also has the investigation, the larger investigation into January 6th and the president's efforts to stay in office. And to the extent that there's anyone who also is participating in that, you want to protect them.
All right, let's bring in former U.S. Attorney and senior FBI official Chuck Rosenberg. Chuck, it's been an extraordinary day. A hearing from the special counsel. He didn't really offer anything in terms of commentary on the evidence they have, more toward defending the integrity of the investigation, and notably inviting people to read it for themselves. It's a little over 40 pages. What did you note about his appearance?
Yeah, a couple of things, Lester. First, I don't think we should have heard from him before. Prosecutors ought not speak about their investigation during their investigation. There's a time and a place to do that. It's after the indictment is unsealed. And second, it's in a court of law. That's where prosecutors ought to speak.
All right, sure. No, please continue. I'm sorry.
Oh, no need to apologize. The other thing I would point out, though, Lester, when he asked Americans to read the indictment, they ought to. I had said that many times about the Mueller report, and I think very few people took me up on it, but you ought to read the indictment. Because when a prosecutor writes an indictment, he or she fly-specs every single word, every phrase. There's a document, an email, a text, a witness who can prove every line in the indictment. If this indictment goes in, as prosecutors if this indictment is proved in federal court, as prosecutors expect it to be, it's going to be a very tough road for Mr. Trump. This is a compelling indictment. There's a lot of damning facts. And if I may add, Lester, the obstruction of justice counts evince intent. One of the hard things for prosecutors to do is to prove intent, that something didn't happen by accident or mistake or inadvertence, that it happened on purpose. And when you cover up a crime, when you mislead your own attorney, when you ask your own attorney to mislead the FBI, all of that evinces intent. and it helps the government to prove its case.
All right, Chuck, thank you. Let me bring in former U.S. Attorney Paul Charlton. He was appointed by a Republican president, former President George W. Bush. I'm curious your thoughts as we kind of bring this all together, what we've witnessed the last several hours.
Well, Lester, let me start with the press conference and say exactly what occurred to me first when I heard this guy talk about this indictment. It is a textbook example of how it is an ethical prosecutor should talk about a criminal proceeding at this stage. And one of the statements that struck me was that he referred to former President Trump not as a former president, but as Donald J. Trump, as if to say, because he is a citizen and someone who's going to be treated just as anybody else would. He encouraged, as my friend Chuck Rosenberg said, everyone to read this indictment. And Chuck and I, as former career prosecutors, have written and supervised the writing of hundreds of indictments. This indictment is artfully crafted. If you think about the way it is, you would talk to a group of lay people, stand in front of a jury, and share with them what it means to have classified information, what it means to be the President of the United States and receive that classified information, and just how important, for example, protecting nuclear secrets might be. And at the very end of this narrative, at the very end of this factual recitation, to say that the president tried to obstruct the investigation, that is the kind of story, narrative, laying out of facts that is going to assist the prosecution in convincing a jury that they have the kind of evidence that they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt to a unanimous verdict.
Let me ask you this. Could the defense simply say, look, there's an expiration date on this intelligence. These are old maps, or this is old information. If that were the case, I don't know that to be the case, would it matter legally?
It won't matter. Remember, there are still documents which are classified relating to the JFK assassination. We have to protect the men and women who gather this information, who help us know what is occurring in the world and how it is we can protect our own nuclear secrets. It isn't just that we have extraordinary abilities to listen in and gather information through intelligence and, say, satellite information, signal intelligence, but we have men and women, humans, beings, citizens who are out in the world collecting this information. And if their identities become known, their lives are at risk. And that doesn't even begin to address what it means for our own national security if our enemies learn how it is we protect our nuclear weapons or our nuclear secrets. So these are important secrets. All nations should have their secrets. We most certainly need to guard those secrets. And principal among those people who should be responsible for making sure that those secrets are not disclosed are the president and the former president of the United States.
All right. Thank you for your thoughts. Let me go to senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson now. Hallie, how is all this playing out?
Well, in a couple of different ways, Lester. I think big picture, in some ways, this indictment has, for now, put a bit of a pause on the reaction from the larger field of Republican candidates. We're still seeing some of it coming in after the specific details of this have come out, but less so than we did, for example, even just 18 hours ago. Here's how I'd put it, Lester. There is a spectrum of response from inside the Republican Party to these, to this indictment, to these charges now that we know very specific details about against Donald Trump. On the one hand, and I would say this is the far smaller end of the spectrum, you have some people suggesting that Donald Trump should withdraw from the race altogether, should stop running for the White House. I will tell you, having covered Donald Trump for many years, and based on the reaction that we've already seen from Mr. Trump himself, that's not going to happen. He's already said and suggested that whatever comes down, he is in this race. He is going to continue running for president. But there is an anti-Trump, I would categorize, contingent who is sort of espousing that viewpoint here. On the other end of the spectrum, you have people like, for example, Congressman Andy Biggs, who just recently tweeted this, that this is now a war phase, eye for an eye, which is, again, I think some people have seen that. There is some concern about what that means. What does that allude to here, right, given the nature of the phrasing here? Allies of the former president in Congress who are supporting him, obviously vociferously, wholeheartedly here, who back up his claims that he is being essentially persecuted by a partisan Department of Justice. You heard Jack Smith lay out the reasons why he believes that this is obviously not a partisan investigation. And then you have kind of the messy middle, candidates who either haven't responded to the specifics of the indictment yet, candidates who have, for example, echoed Donald Trump's concerns about the Department of Justice, but have stopped short of defending Donald Trump himself. I've seen, for example, former Trump aides who have since broken with him. One of them, Sarah Matthews, had high-profile testimony in that January 6th hearing, who suggested that given how extraordinary some of these details are related to national security secrets in this indictment, people who have come out supporting Donald Trump may have egg on their faces. Now, again, we're going to have to see how this plays out on the campaign trail. Donald Trump is getting out on the campaign trail. He's got a party at Bedminster the night that he is supposed to be in Miami after he gets back from being arraigned down there on these federal charges, Lester. So this is a political grenade in a Republican race. It is not an unexpected one, given the tea leaves that we had been reading, given the signals that we have been seeing. You'll hear a lot about the last indictment for the former president, the one in Manhattan, state-level charges, very different. At the time, you look at the polling numbers, Donald Trump did not have any erosion of Republican support. The question is, given this particular indictment, the federal charges here, what happens in not a primary, Lester, but in a general election, right? How does this play for people who are not part of that conservative Republican base who may have these concerns over Donald Trump? Words that I've heard from people just in talking to over the last 24 hours, words like drama, words like distraction. I think even Nikki Haley used those words in a different context here talking about this indictment. So this is obviously a huge political story in addition to being a huge legal story, Lester.
And a big piece of history we're recording right now. Let me bring in Catherine Christian. She's a former Manhattan Assistant District Attorney and an NBC News legal analyst. Thank you for remaining with us. Let me ask you about, I think most people get the concept of the nation wants to keep its military secrets for multiple reasons. But what has been the practical effect of these secrets and these documents that are alleged to have been taken unlawfully?
Well, it appears, Lester, that half of the intelligence community has been impacted. 7 agencies in the U.S. intelligence community have been impacted by Donald Trump's retention of this information and these national security secrets. So you're talking about the CIA, the Department of Defense, the NSA. So you're talking about people who spy, people who electronic intelligence, you know, mapping information, secret satellites. So it's pretty, I don't use the word dire, but what this impact is could be very, very harmful. It's also clear from this indictment that Donald Trump allegedly micromanaged the retention of this information. He was in charge. He can't say an aide did it, you know, my lawyer did it. It's clear that his hands were directly on the retention of this documents. And also, there are going to be people who are going to say, oh, this is a bunch of rogue FBI agents. If you read through the indictment, it was based on inside information, people who worked for Mr. Trump. They're the ones who took the photos, supplied the text messages. Many of them testified. So these are people who were in Mar-a-Lago, who saw what was happening, who probably assisted in, you know, we know one of them who's been indicted as a co-conspirator assisted in moving. But there were others who have not been charged, probably because they gave information that had been helpful. So this was not a bunch of rogue FBI agents who are making these things up. That may be the defense, but I think, you know, what Jack Smith said, it's about the trial. He's innocent to proven guilty. This lays it out. And I think there's a reason why Jack Smith was very discreet, said nothing, and just said, read the indictment.
All right, Catherine, thank you. Let me turn back to Laura. Do we get to the answer to the question why? Even if you allow, as the former president says, he had a right to declassify this information, do we know why he wanted that material?
What his motivation was?
Is that laid out in there?
It's really not explored, but for prosecutors, it actually doesn't matter. Motive is not relevant to the charges that they're bringing here. So whether he did it because he wanted to show off the documents, because he thought that they were an interesting some memento from his time in the White House, or there was some other nefarious purpose to harm U.S. interests, it actually doesn't matter. His motive legally doesn't matter. Of course, it's interesting for us, and it's interesting for the public to understand why in the world someone would do this.
Yeah, we know there's just two descriptions of him showing people the documents, but we don't know for what purpose.
But even when you read his own words, according to prosecutors there, you get the sense he's doing it because he thought it was cool. That is sort of the mood and the tenor of the language that they've included.
Danny nodding his head here.
Yes, and this is the rare case, too, where we have a kind of preview of the defense. Trump's attorneys have written letters to Congress. They've gone on TV. And I expect this narrative that they're going to try to develop at trial, that Trump was like every other president becoming an ex-president. The difference was, they will say, that the National Archives gave agency support to those other presidents that they didn't give to Trump. For those other presidents, they set up shop at wherever that ex-president was moving to. They helped out. They participated in the process. They will argue that Trump was sort of left out in the cold, left to his own devices and his staff who may not have understood the seriousness of what they were doing. Those defenses will be challenging. For example, Trump didn't have a right to possess the documents. He may have had a right of access to the documents, but access to documents that would have been with the National Archives. In other words, the National Archives was entitled to get them back, and then Trump could make an appointment to go visit them anytime he liked. That is the way that was supposed to go. So Trump's defense will center around, look, I was working on it. I was going to get everything back. It was you, government, that wouldn't accept a rolling production. In other words, we'll give you the documents as we find them. It was you, government, that set an arbitrary date for us to turn over these documents. The defense has already signaled this is their plan. I expect they will go through with that, although they've had a major personnel change in the last 24 hours. Does that change the strategy and tactics? Maybe, but maybe not.
And then there's the what about defense. What about Joe Biden, who's under investigation for classified items?
Yeah, that's folded into it, because part of that is, look at these other presidents since Ronald Reagan. They've had all this assistance, and they were shown every deference. And when documents were found at their homes, like, for example, Vice President Biden, it was not treated the same way. So the government has already anticipated this. They've surely anticipated those defenses, and they'll deal with them at trial. The defense, too, now we have an idea where they're going to go with it. It is an interesting narrative if they choose to go that way. Will it be persuasive with a jury? Who knows? That's the reality, is that all of these complex cases present a fundamental challenge to the government. Take these complicated issues, digest them, and present them in a way to the jury that gets you beyond a reasonable doubt, but doesn't confuse them.
Laura, cut you off. I'm sorry.
No, we should make it clear, though, I think, for folks at home, that we're talking about a very different number of documents. The sheer magnitude that's described here is very different than the situations for former Vice President Pence or President Biden. Also, the efforts to retrieve them, all of the many times that he was asked, please give them back, going so far as to get a search warrant to give them back. That stands in stark contrast to the situations for Pence and Biden.
And we keep showing these stacks of documents. If I read the narrative in the indictment today, these were being moved. They needed a place to put them, so they put them in a ballroom, and then they needed that space for office space, so they ended up in a bathroom, I believe.
They're moving them in various different locations over a period of months, but the period that's most critical is what happens to them after the grand jury subpoena comes down. And that's when you start to see them moving them in an effort to conceal them, according to prosecutors. All
right, let me bring in our senior White House correspondent, Kelly O'Donnell. Kelly, we mentioned that President Biden is under investigation, another special counsel, so I would think there's not a lot of incentive for the White House to be speaking publicly, but maybe I'm wrong. What are you hearing?
Now, you're right about that, Lester. This White House is saying that it will not comment on the Trump indictment, and the aides and advisors who would be involved in those kinds of decisions are saying don't expect that to change. The president himself has been questioned about this a number of different times and has, in his own way, responded, including today in North Carolina, when members of the reporting pool who were traveling with him asked about the indictment, asked about any interaction he may have had with the Attorney General Merrick Garland, and the president was very very clear that he does not want to comment on the Trump indictment and that he has not discussed it with his own attorney general. Yesterday, our colleague Peter Alexander asked the president about public confidence in the Justice Department and in the fairness of any potential prosecution. We didn't know at that time the indictment was going to be made public. And President Biden did choose to respond. And he said, the public can understand this because, in his words, I have never asked them to take an action or not take an action at the Department of Justice. And he said, I'm honest. So that answer from the president, and he was animated when he delivered it, may fill a space for quite some time on this issue. Politically, of course, the Biden campaign has in many ways been preparing for a rematch, a rival campaign against the former president. So you've got a predecessor and a current rival. And politically, they are suited to take him on if Donald Trump were to secure the nomination and be a candidate in 2024, because they did that in 2020. So politically, this raises lots of questions. And in many ways, you could argue that the Biden campaign would want to draw that same rematch again, because they won in 2020 and they know the lay of the land there, as opposed to another Republican candidate rising to the nomination. So don't expect much to be said on that. On the Biden documents matter, we are told that he will submit to an interview with the special counsel assigned to that. That is not Jack Smith. It's a different individual who's handling that case. And some of those documents go back to his time as vice president in the Obama administration that are a part of this. That pursuit is still ongoing. We know that the Mike Pence case has now been closed with no charges against him. Lester?
Right. Kelly, thank you very much. Let me bring back former federal prosecutor and NBC News legal analyst Carol Lamb. Carol, let's talk for a moment about the judge initially assigned this case, or at least handled the start of the case, Eileen Cannon. I think that name may ring familiar to a lot of people, and some rulings that she made that seem to go in favor of the former president. What more can you tell us?
Well, I have actually talked to colleagues in the Southern District of Florida, and the belief at this point is that Judge Cannon is likely to keep this case all the way through trial. It is likely that this case went to her in the first place because she did handle that search warrant issue that you referred to, Lester. And having done that, this ended up as a so-called related case to that issue, and so the case went to her. But there is not really a process then for taking the case away from her. Usually the two judges, if there is another judge assigned, if another judge had been assigned, he would then discuss with Judge Cannon about which of them should keep the case. But in this case, the case did go to her. So I think the problem this creates, and Jack Smith would have anticipated this possibility that Judge Cannon would have this case, and he felt that nonetheless it should be brought in the Southern District of Florida. The risk here is timing, because although cases can and often do move quickly, there are going to be a plethora of issues here that are what we call a first impression. That is, they don't have a lot of precedent, and some of those issues may be immediately appealable to the appellate court. So if this does not move quickly, and we saw one of the problems with the search warrant issue was that Judge Cannon imposed a system, a structure that slowed down the investigation to the point where she had to be overruled by the appellate court. If this goes on too long, we end up in a potential scenario where President Trump is elected again, and then who knows what's going to happen, and a sitting president has pardon powers, and we will truly be in uncharted waters at that point.
And you're opening up a subject I think could keep us here for a very long time, moving one step at a time. But as we near the end of our time here, Laura, did it have to get this far? I mean, all of us remember certainly the big serving of the search warrant, the police, and that was our first awareness generally. But as you read this, were there places along here that this could have been settled without where we are now?
Absolutely, and not just in the moment where he decides to take classified documents after he's no longer president, but it really does come down to what happens after the grand jury search subpoena comes in. I think that's a meaningful marker at which, if he had just given them back before that, even despite all the bickering with National Archives, if he had given it back before that, I think we would be in a very different place. After the subpoena comes in, all of the moving of the documents, that's where you see all the concealment, and it's a whole bunch of other crimes come in after that moment.
Danny, real quick.
This didn't become a DOJ investigation until other agencies tried and failed to get the documents back. That alone lets you draw an inference that had these documents been handled back before DOJ got involved, DOJ might have never gotten involved.
All right, Danny, and Laura, thank you as well. That concludes this NBC News special report. Our coverage continues on our streaming network, NBC News Now. We'll have much more tonight on NBC Nightly News. I'm Lester Holt in New York. Good day, and thank you for watching.